Hey students, welcome to Mr. Moore's AP European History, week 28 notes. During this week, we'll be talking about World War II. If you go back to week 27, I did an overview of World War II. And the week before that, I also did like the rise of dictators and the rise of fascism in Europe and totalitarianism in the Soviet Union, and of course dealing with Imperial Japan. So this is actually kind of in a sort of way the third set of notes in a series on World War II. Next week I'm going to deal with World War II in Asia. So we're only going to deal with one half of World War II this week. This is designed for AP European history, but in general, I'm going to cover the war and we're going to see what it was like in the European theater of the war. As I talked about last week when I did my overview, you'll remember that there are two distinct theaters of the war. There's the European conflict that we're going to focus on today. And when I say European theater, we're going to deal with getting supplies across the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic, troop movement, and supplies being brought to Europe to save Europe from the United States. This was happening way before the United States officially entered the war. We'll also deal with a lot of fighting in North Africa. There's fighting in the Middle East. There's even fighting in as far down as in sub-Saharan Africa. But a lot of the really big battles will take place up here in the northern part. And of course, next week, not this week, we'll focus on what the war was like over in the Asian theater. So we're going to dive right into it because there's a ton of stuff that we would like to cover. And I'd like to start us off at the very beginning. In the 1930s, when Hitler comes to power and secures his place as the Führer, right? As the leader of the German people. And what we're going to do, we're going to talk about Hitler's first moves towards war. And I think that the first real move towards war is when Hitler decides to officially break the Treaty of Versailles. One of the things that the Treaty of Versailles that was written and drafted in 1919 after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, it redraws the map of Europe. And the Treaty of Versailles forces Germany to pay reparations to the Allied powers that won, especially France. The other thing that the Treaty of Versailles did is it made it illegal for Germany to have a military. They were allowed to have a policing force to be able to regulate the affairs of their own country domestically, like inside of Germany. So during the Weimar Republic, Germany did have a small policing force, but they were not allowed to have a military of any substantiation. The other piece of the Treaty of Versailles actually took a chunk of Germany away from Germany. It was the chunk of Germany that's right next to France. That's that part of Germany that's on the west side of the Rhine River. And it's like really the industrial heart of Germany. It was and is. And so to take that away from Germany was like a stab in the back or like a nail in the coffin. It's one of the things that really pushed the Germans over the edge, feeling hurt and betrayed by what happened at the end of World War I. So Hitler's first bold move was to move military, his own military, into the Rhineland and really secure all the national boundaries of Germany. And one of the reasons that he did this was A, to test the waters, and B, because he had already seen, what Mussolini was doing down in Ethiopia, and the Allies talked, like, hey, that's not okay, you can't do that, but they didn't do anything to stop Mussolini, and Hitler feels like they're not going to do anything to stop him. It's a risky move. At this point, he's not ready for war with the Allies, but he's kind of banking on the fact that everybody's still traumatized from World War I. And economically, nobody's in a position really to do anything about him. And here's the other piece of the puzzle. You got to remember that the Rhineland is technically a part of Germany. And so if Hitler moves troops into the Rhineland, it would be very difficult for the Allies to say that he's doing anything wrong. If Hitler goes to them and says, in essence, "Hey, you're gonna start a war with me because I'm moving troops into a part of my own country? Are you kidding me?" Imagine this: if the United States moved troops into northern Mexico, if we moved our troops across the border into Mexico, Mexico could rightfully say that we invaded and maybe that we were starting a war. They might feel justified in attacking us because we invaded their sovereignty. But if the United States military gets moved into Arizona or Southern California or into Texas, well, quite frankly, Mexico can't really say anything. That's just the United States moving its own troops into its own territory. So basically, Hitler is moving troops into a part of Germany. Now, this part had been demilitarized because France wanted, really, they wanted to know for a surety that there wasn't going to be a second war. And so Hitler moves in to this Rhineland. And that's a bold move. And the Allies scream, they get angry, they write harsh diplomatic letters, you know, but they don't do anything militarily. And it kind of solidifies it in Hitler's brain that they're scared of war and they're not going to stop him. And this is part of his justification for uniting the German people of Europe. And he's going to use this argument again and again. He's going to say, I don't want war. What I want to do is to get all of the German people into one country so they're protected. So they're a part of the Reich, right? The empire. Once he has success on securing his own country, Hitler then moves his military into Austria. Now, this is a slow process where officials are paid off, indoctrination happens to key leaders. The people of Austria know that this is going to happen. And the people of Austria speak German. In fact, it's been pointed out a lot of times that the most famous German, maybe in the history of the world, Hitler, is actually from Austria. He's actually born in Austria. Okay. And so he joins the German military during World War I, which kind of, makes him feel like he's a part of this fatherland, part of the German feel. But he and a lot of people always felt like the problem with Germany and the reason that they were an underdog is because they weren't united, like the French, right? The people who speak French are in France, right? Now, there are some other outlying areas, and of course, colonies where people speak French. There's like a part of Belgium that's French speaking and such. But in general, the French speaking people and culturally the French people are in one united nation state, right? So it gives them a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose and feeling. And that's what Hitler, at least this is the propaganda. This is what Hitler was saying. He says, I don't want to start a war. All I'm trying to do is to get all the German people into one country so that we can, have a fair shake at it and our economy can be strong. And so we can look out for the German people. And he says, look, I'm not starting a war. The people of Austria want me. And the proof is that he went in without resistance, right? His military moves in and nobody fights it. And they annex or adopt Austria as part of the collective German Empire. So Austria and Germany fuse like into one piece that Hitler's calling the Third Reich, right? The Third Empire. This happens in 1938. Some people refer to this as the Anschluss, and that is the incorporating of Austria into the German Empire. And it makes a lot of sense because they were German speaking, the culture is very similar, and there was a lot of ideological similarities between Austrians and the Germans. They had fought together in World War I, and both of them had felt shafted. Remember at the end of World War I, when they're redrawing the map of Europe, that is, the Treaty of Versailles is redrawing the map of Europe, Austria gets diced apart. Austria controlled a lot of other ethnic groups. They controlled the Czechs and the Slovaks. They controlled parts of what we call Yugoslavia during this time. Today is like the Balkans area, places like Slovenia and Croatia and of course Hungary and parts of Romania. So Austria was a very multicultural place, and after World War I, when they redrew the map, really just the German-speaking part was the new Austria, and so that's what Hitler incorporates. Now, again, no shots are really being fired. Maybe there's some intimidation, some bullying by Nazi officials, but still nobody's resisting this. And of course, the other powers like France and Great Britain, they see Hitler making some of these bold moves, but it's really difficult to start a war if he's not attacking anyone. And it's really difficult to say, Hitler, you shouldn't do this when Hitler's actually from Austria, right? So there's a lot of justification. Hitler's not starting a war. He's just getting all the German people into one collective country. Now, the next move that Hitler makes is moving into something called the Sudetenland. So there was a country called Czechoslovakia. Today, it's two countries, Czech Republic and Slovakia. Um, it was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but there is a part of Czechoslovakia that's right next to Germany where the people living there actually speak German instead of speaking Czech. And Hitler wanted, again, he's using this justification of nationalism. He wants all of the German speaking people in Europe to be protected, to be collectively under his leadership. They want him to be the leader. This is the propaganda. And so he pushes for this. He actually meets with the Allies in this case, because this is kind of stepping out of the bounds a little bit. He actually meets in a place called München, right? Munich, the Munich Pact. And he sits down with some of the Allied leaders and he says, look, you guys don't want war, and I don't want war. I mean, all of us who lived through World War I, none of us want that. So if you want to start a war because I'm trying to get all the Germans into one country, that's on you. I'm not causing trouble. I'm trying to help and protect. We're trying to make Germany great again, right? We're trying to revitalize our country because we are so devastated from World War I. People like Neville Chamberlain, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is particularly famous for appeasing Hitler, right? Nobody wants war, and so they're willing to give Hitler, and Hitler's great. Hitler is great at pushing the boundaries. Most teenagers are great at pushing the boundaries, right? Mom and dad say you got to be home at 11 o'clock, and so you show up at 11:15, and they're like, you're late, and they're like, what? It's 15 minutes, Mom, Dad. Come on, it's not like the end of the world, right? I'm not doing anything bad. I'm only 15 minutes late. Parents are like, all right, don't let it happen again. You got away with it, so now you can push it a little bit further the next time, right? Like Hitler's mentality is like the ultimate teenage brain here. He's pushing the boundaries. They didn't stop me in the Rhineland. They said I was grounded, but they really didn't do anything. And then when I moved into Austria, they screamed even louder and said that's not okay, but they didn't do anything. And so now he's going to push the boundary a little bit more. This time he actually sits down with the leaders and he says, look, man, all I want is the German speaking part of Czechoslovakia. You guys drew up the map wrong. In the Treaty of Versailles, you screwed us with reparations, and you screwed us with the disarmament, and you screwed us with the map. You took some of the German people away from us who want to be in Germany. And honestly, some of them did. If you're a minority in a country, you don't have a lot of political say. And so some of those Germans did want to be a part of Germany. And so Hitler gets permission from the Allies to move into the Sudetenland. And so he does. He moves his troops into the Sudetenland, and then he pushes further. And he does it in a sly way so that he can always pull that card, I'm not doing anything wrong. If there's a little bit of resistance and some problems, he might have to extend his boundary a little bit further. And then there might be some other problems where he's just protecting the people of Czechoslovakia, or he's got to make sure that the German people in Sudetenland feel safe. So he's got to make sure a giant military's there. By the end of it, he has the entire country of Czechoslovakia under his control. Now, Number 4 is the most important one. You're going to circle number 4. You're going to put a highlighter on it because this is when World War II starts in Europe. It's the final step where Hitler's using this same excuse, where he's saying, I'm not starting a war. I'm just trying to get all the German people into one country. If you guys start a war, it's on you. So here's the situation. There is a piece of Germany that is not attached to the rest, literally. It's called East Prussia. And after World War I, the country of Poland was re-put on the map. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles does a lot of map changes. So there's an actual piece of Germany that's not attached to the rest of Germany, and there's a slice of Poland in between. An American might think of, like, say, the 48 contiguous states and Alaska. If I want to, like when I was in college, I went and worked in Alaska one summer. I had to leave the United States and go through Canada to go back into a part of the United States, right? Alaska is separated from the rest of the United States by a piece of Canada, a pretty large piece of Canada. It's something similar to that with this East Prussia. They called it the Polish Corridor. It's a chunk of Poland where if you wanted to go from, say, the main part of Germany to East Prussia, you had to go through Poland. And Hitler said, I want to connect all of Germany together. That's traditionally been a part of Germany, and it was. There's those Teutonic Knights during the medieval times that had secured rights. And when Prussia started to grow out of the old Holy Roman Empire, that land really was, in traditional sense, it really was German, nobility and German royal lands. And of course, the capital of Germany, Berlin, is very much in the eastern part of the country. And so Hitler says that he wants to connect all of Germany together. He's still using that same excuse. And so he wants to go into Poland and seize that part of Poland. But here's the problem. Russia has traditionally claimed parts of Poland historically as well. And if there's anybody in Europe that Hitler actually is maybe a little nervous about, who maybe he does respect, he doesn't like him, but he kind of respects him because he knows he's just as crazy as he is, and that's Stalin. And so Hitler knows he can't go into Poland without first striking a deal with Stalin. Because if he goes and he takes all of Poland, well, then he's going to have a huge mess on his hands because the Soviet Union is claiming that same territory. Okay? So what happens is the Germans and the Russians sit down and they strike an agreement. The Soviets, the Russians, and the Germans don't like each other, and they're on completely opposite sides politically. You've got communism on the far left in the Soviet Union, and you've got fascism on the far right with Germany. But they do strike a non-aggression pact. Okay, this Molotov-Ribbentrop, this is a non-aggression pact. They sign it before invading. So on the designated time in September of 1939, the Germans invade. At the same time, the Russians invade, or the Soviet army invades. Some people will say that World War II starts when Hitler invaded Poland. But if we're being realistic, the Soviets invaded at the exact same time. And this is when France and Great Britain officially declare war. However, they really are still scared to do it. It's like when a parent threatens really hard and says, if you do that, I'm gonna. They're hoping that kid's gonna back down. And that's what France and Great Britain were really hoping, that Hitler would back down if they said, we declare war. Because they don't actually attack, they just start to mobilize. The problem is Hitler's more than mobilized. He's already on the go. So Britain and France declare war, but they do nothing. Sometimes people call this part of World War II the phony war, right? So Hitler continues his blitzkrieg technique, and he takes two countries right next to Germany, Denmark and Norway. and he does so in a few weeks. Why would he invade Denmark and Norway? Who cares about Denmark and Norway? That's because he wants the natural resources. He wants oil. Norway is quite rich in oil, and if he's going to need a war machine, right? He needs access to coastal lines, and he needs access to oil, and so he invades Denmark and Norway. Once Britain and France declare war, he doesn't have to pretend like all he's doing is just uniting the people of Germany. That pretense is dropped, and he just goes at it. And he does so in just a matter of weeks. The Germans use a technique that's often referred to as Blitzkrieg, and that's lightning war. And that's where you use air power and fast moving mobile units, right? These new tanks that are developed by World War II, and motorcades, motorcycles, and automobiles. The speed at which the German army can move is unlike anything that anyone has ever seen in the history of the world. Now, I just explained some things, so let's just rehash what we just learned. Let's look at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and let's look at it geographically. You see this blue line right here? This is the chunk of Germany that's called the Rhineland. It's right next to France. It actually borders Belgium and the Netherlands as well. The Rhine River starts in the Alps and it dumps out, by Antwerp, Rotterdam, that kind of an area in the Dutch areas. And so this is a very industrial powerhouse, of Germany. And it had been taken from them after World War I. So the first move that Hitler does is he moves troops into the Rhineland. It's a part of his country, so nobody puts up a big stink. I mean, they get mad, they yell, they write bad letters, but they don't do anything. Number 2, remember, Hitler moves his Nazi army into Austria without a fight. And remember that Hitler is actually from Austria, and the people of Austria speak German. Okay, so you can see that was easily justifiable. Okay, and remember that Hitler and Mussolini are buddies, so he's kind of just connected the central part of Europe. It gives him comfort, power, prestige. I mean, he's starting to really show off his ability. Okay, so that's number 2, the Anschluss. Now, number 3 is called the Sudetenland. You see how far Czechoslovakia goes into the German lands? Okay, so these people that live in this part of Czechoslovakia are very Germanic. They speak German. Most of the people in the Czech Republic today speak Czech. It's a different language. It's more Eastern Europe, more Slavic in its origins. So it's very different from German. And so these people, he wanted to incorporate them into the German Empire. And looking at it geographically, you can kind of say, oh, that makes sense. So he goes to incorporate the Sudetenland, and he ends up taking all of Czechoslovakia, or at least those parts that are easily accessible to him, that doesn't piss off Stalin, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's step number 3. Now remember, step number 4 is the big one. This is where Hitler is going to connect East Prussia to the rest of Germany. So this is where they're going to invade Poland under the pretext of uniting, again, the German peoples. So they're going to move all the way into Poland, taking about half of Poland. It wasn't just this little connector. He's going to go ahead and take a giant chunk of Poland under the assumption that nobody's going to do anything about it. And of course, he has to work out a deal with Stalin before he does that, because Stalin is also laying claim, right? So this is the line dividing Poland and Germany, right, when they invade in 1939. That's when France and Great Britain are going to declare war on Germany, but they're not going to do anything about it. So quickly, and I mean within a matter of weeks, Hitler's going to seize Denmark and Norway. Okay, and what he does there, it's really some incredibly tricky stuff. The British actually do get a little bit involved in trying to protect, but it's like a little too late kind of a thing. And within a couple of weeks, Hitler has secured Denmark and Norway. Now, when I turn the page here, we're going to get into a few other things. We're going to start to look at what Hitler does next. And I want you to keep this map in mind. We'll go over it again with the next 5 steps to where Hitler reaches the height of his power. So this is, you can see Mussolini here with Hitler. You can see people like Neville Chamberlain and representatives from France as Hitler meets with the Allies and says, hey, look, we're going to take the Sudetenland. We want peace. And Chamberlain thought he was going to be a hero because he was going to be the guy who prevented World War II. In the end, history is not very kind to Neville Chamberlain. They see him as giving in to Hitler, appeasing him, and maybe being one of the major problems that kind of gives Hitler this attitude of nobody's going to stop me. So this just says in 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, along with representatives from France and Italy, signed the Munich Pact with the German leader Adolf Hitler. The pact, this pact that they signed allowed Hitler a cession of getting the Sudetenland, right? This German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. And Chamberlain said, this is going to bring peace in our times, but today most people see this as just a symbol of appeasement. If you are dealing with a psychopath like Hitler, giving him an inch means he's going to take a foot. You've maybe heard that expression before. These picture of troops, German troops entering Poland, and they devastate the Polish army. Of course, Blitzkrieg is the lightning war, and in September of 1939, both the Soviets and the Nazis invade from different directions, and Poland doesn't have a chance. Okay, and these are some pictures of German troops. You can almost always tell German troops by the style of their helmet. They're very effective, and they've got some of the best equipment, and there's some of the best trained. I mean, Prussia was always historically known for being militaristic. So let's move on to step number 6. And step number 6 is the mother of all steps. 6 and 7 are really combined together. Because the grand prize, what Hitler really wants to do is he wants payback on France for the humiliation of World War I. But in order to get to France, he's going to pull a move out of history and kind of do a similar thing that he did, that the Germans did in World War I. It's not the exact same, of course it's not, but he's going to go through Belgium, and he's going to take out the Dutch areas. Remember in World War I, the Schlieffen Plan, where the German army kind of had this idea to go around France by swinging through Belgium. And their idea was to hit Paris and win the war in a couple of weeks or a month. Well, they're going to do a very similar thing again. The problem is that in between World War I and World War II, the French spend like those 20 years building the most amazing defensive line in the history of the world. Let me just rewind the clock here. They build what's called the Maginot Line. And the Maginot Line is not just a trench. It's a 3-story trench. The trenches that were built during World War I were hastily made. You know, kind of a grassroots kind of, they're shooting machine guns at us. If we don't dig into the ground, we're dead. So trenches started out as foxholes, you know, soldiers digging them in the dirt. And then when they got to pass supplies to each other, they connect their foxholes. And pretty soon you have a line of trenches from Switzerland to, the Straits here, the English Channel. And so after World War I, the French built fancy trenches, purposefully built them, like engineered. So after the war was done, France spent a whole bunch of money cementing trenches. I mean, concrete trenches. And they put elevators in them where, say, like on the bottom floor or the bottom level, you might have like an underground metro system, a train system. So you could ship supplies up and down this trench wherever you want. If you want to see something interesting, go Google Maginot Line. Pause this video and go Google the Maginot Line. It's really fascinating. And like one layer would have been like a bunkhouses and living quarters with places to prep food. And then in the top one, they'd have munitions and gun supplies and access out so they could move troops up and down this concrete 3-story trench. The Maginot Line. It was impenetrable. And the guns all faced Germany. And they'd have these like guns stationed every, I don't know, 100 yards or so. Giant, huge artillery pieces and machine gun nests. So it was almost impenetrable. The thing about the Maginot Line, though, is it stops at Belgium. Because the Belgians didn't want to be on the wrong side of the Maginot Line. If the French just kept building it, Belgium was saying, "Hey, whoa, you're putting your guns at our backs. That's not a safe feeling, if you're in front of the guns." So they were trying to work out some agreement. There was some debate who's going to pay for it. Should the Maginot Line go up and include Belgium or the Netherlands? So it stopped right here. So the basic premise is this: when war breaks out, of course the Maginot Line is heavily fortified, but the bulk of the French army is going to come up on the border of Belgium, where the Maginot Line isn't. And the Germans are actually going to sneak through in a certain way right here in the Ardennes forest. They're going to kind of come in between the bulk of the French army and the Maginot Line. I mean, they're going to hit the Maginot Line, but they're going to send through, they're going to crack the line right here where the two meet. It's a really thick forested area, and nobody thinks that giant numbers of troops can go through there. But the Germans surprise them. So number 6 is Germany moving into Belgium and the Netherlands, but really it's to get to France. So let me fast forward back here to 6. The Wehrmacht, that's the German army, goes around the Maginot Line on its way to take France. And so in 1940, it invades Belgium and the Netherlands. The Nazis take France in 6 weeks. The French army caves. World War I. For 4 years, the French held out. For 4 years, the French stopped the Germans from invading, at great financial cost and at the great cost of lives. And Hitler does in 6 weeks what the World War I German war machine couldn't do in 4 years. Takes France. The British send troops, the British Expeditionary Force, right? The British don't have a giant army. What the British have is a giant navy. The French have a giant army, and the French army falls apart. The British don't have a giant army. What they have is a giant navy, and so they send what army they have into Belgium and into France to try to stop the Nazis from coming. But when the French army breaks down, the British are surrounded next to the seashore at a place called Dunkirk. And Hitler has a chance to utterly and completely destroy the British army. A lot of people say that Hitler didn't destroy it because he was hoping that the British would just say, "Hey, whoa, time out, uncle," right? We call it. Oh, we give up. The British don't. And there's a miraculous rescue where like every ship in Great Britain is sent to the coastline. It's right there where Belgium and France meet. That's where you'd find Dunkirk. And the British are able to rescue like 99% of their army. The Germans, this is one of those mistakes where people say, if Hitler had just destroyed the British army, he might have won the war right then and there. He had a chance to. Some people are saying, well, diplomatically, it was smarter to get the British to surrender. Then he doesn't have to, fight them at all. He does the job, but they don't surrender. They escape. And so it's a very famous, there's a great movie called Dunkirk, and you can watch tons of videos on it on YouTube. It's amazing. The French cave, and the Germans establish what they call the Vichy government. It's a French government that supports Nazis. It's a French government that supports the Germans. So the Germans defeat the French, and they instigate like a puppet government. And so it's almost like France becomes on the same side as the Germans. Now, there's, of course, a French resistance throughout the entire war, and there are certain French who never give in to the Nazis. We talked about Charles de Gaulle last week, and he's really the leader of the French resistance throughout the war, and that's why he's one of the most famous French guys ever. Definitely the most important Frenchman in the 20th century. He's the president after the war, and he even comes back out of retirement after some political problems during the Cold War and helps reinstigate the Fifth Republic of France, which is currently the republic that France is under today. So huge, big deal. Now, the next step, of course, is Great Britain. Great Britain rescued their troops at the Battle of Dunkirk. But now Hitler has a major problem because all these other countries he can basically roll into with his tanks. The problem with Great Britain is it's an island, and the British have the best navy in the world. And so the Battle of Britain is in 1941. The Nazis want to take the UK, but the Luftwaffe never gets control of the skies. The Luftwaffe is the German Air Force. And so the Germans launch this gigantic, huge raid onto Great Britain, bombing the heck out of everything. They start bombing London nightly. They start destroying all of the infrastructure, the factories, and even just civilian targets. And the RAF, that's the Royal Air Force, has a secret weapon. It's a new technology called radar. And of course, what radar, you guys have all heard of radar because every airport in the world uses radar today. You send out a strong signal and it bounces off objects. And so you get an idea where aircraft are hours before you can see them. Okay. And so even though the Royal Air Force, the RAF, the British Air Force, has less planes, they can maximize where they send them because they can tell where the Germans are coming from. And so the kill ratio is definitely lopsided. The RAF is destroying way more aircraft than the Germans are destroying RAF. And so even though Great Britain is getting pounded, in the end, Hitler never gets full control of the skies. And so he has to abandon his plans to invade Great Britain. The British call this the Blitz. And I remember a couple years ago, I took my family and we were walking around the streets of London, and you can still see buildings that have plaques on them with these huge explosion pieces, chunks of the building still missing, and they'll have plaques and they're like, "This was destroyed during the Blitz." Just a reminder for people in London that they didn't give up. They didn't surrender. They fought on, even when it looked like there was nobody else to help them. The British stand alone against the Nazis, and they get punched in the face. I mean, they get bloodied up. It looks like they're going to cave, but they don't. And one of the keys is, of course, Chamberlain. Chamberlain is out, and Churchill comes in. People started to see that Chamberlain was wrong to try to appease Hitler. And so Winston Churchill, who is an MP, a member of parliament, he gets the support of the people and he becomes the PM, the prime minister. And he gives these amazing speeches on the radio, pumping up the people of Great Britain. And he really takes leadership, and everybody's like, well, he was right all along. Chamberlain was wrong. Churchill is right. And Great Britain holds on. Now, at the same time that all of this is happening, Germany's friend, ally, Italy, is supposed to be taking care of stuff in the south. And if you look at the map, it's obvious why. Italy is the southern power. And before the war, Mussolini was kind of seen as the leader of the fascist, and kind of like Hitler was his right-hand man. But when the war breaks out, the Italian army is not as effective. And so Hitler, they draw up plans, and basically what I'm going to say is that Hitler says, hey, you got to take out Greece, you got to take out Yugoslavia, the Balkans, and you got to control Albania. And quite frankly, you got to control North Africa. Like, that's your sphere. The problem is that the Italians don't do a good job of that. And so Hitler has to take some of his resources that he could have, maybe should have used to, take over the British. And he has to employ them to help Mussolini do what he couldn't do. Hitler starts to get mad at Mussolini, kind of in essence, and I'm simplifying here, but he's basically saying, dude, you had one job. Your job was to take out little tiny Greece. Greece! And you couldn't do that. We had to go do Greece. You had one job to control the Balkans, Yugoslavia. You couldn't do that. We already had, everything was under control in North Africa, and you're losing control. So the Germans have to go and pick up the slack. And that's one of the things, by the time we're done today, I'm going to bring up. This is another problem for Hitler. Hitler's friend, Italy, didn't pull their weight in the war. And so it costs resources. Instead of Italy being a help, Italy actually is like a hindrance. They're not helping Hitler and the Germans win the war. Hitler's having to divide his forces to go do the work that Italy was supposed to do. Now, this last one, number 10, is where Hitler hits the peak of his power. And after that, I'm going to talk about how the Allies come back and win. Here's the big mistake, too. Hitler should have finished off the British. He should have stuck to the British and finished the job. Hitler didn't lose the Battle of Britain, per se. He just didn't finish the job. He saw the British on the edge of collapse, which they kind of were. Okay? He should have finished the job. Instead of finishing the job, he picks a fight, and he opens up a part of the war where he always wanted to go. If you look at Mein Kampf, the book that Hitler wrote when he was in jail, he kind of outlined his plan. And in Mein Kampf, he talked about Lebensraum, this living space. He wanted to move into Eastern Europe, clean the people out of Eastern Europe, aka kill them, and open the land up for German expansion. And so ultimately, what he really wants, and he sees the Russians, the Slavic people of Europe, just as that root word says, as slaves, as lesser people. And so he decides to invade the Soviet Union. The biggest army ever assembled in the history of the world is the Nazi army that was secretly deployed to the Eastern Front to invade the Soviet Union. Remember, they had signed a non-aggression pact back when they invaded Poland, but Hitler's going to break that. He's going to stab Stalin in the metaphorical back, and he's going to do a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. The Germans called this Operation Barbarossa. It was a 3-pronged attack. So we just talked. Let me just recap for a second. Remember, step number 1 was the Rhineland, right? That part of Germany. Step number 2, Austria. If you do this with me in your head, you'll actually be learning how Hitler takes over Europe. Step number 3, the Sudetenland, right? Step number 4 is this, they call the Polish Corridor, the invasion of Poland. This is the start of World War II, right? This is where Great Britain and France actually declare war. Step number 5 was Denmark and Norway. Step number 6 is really to try to get to France, but in order to get there around the Maginot Line, we're going through the Dutch areas, Belgium and the Netherlands, right? So step 7 is France. Okay, there was an occupied part of France where the Germans, the Nazis, actually had their troops. And then there was the Vichy-controlled France that was a pro-Nazi French government, which, here's something interesting. Pause for a minute. That means that all of the territories, like North Africa and parts of, say, Southeast Asia, that France did control are now all German-controlled, right? It's not just France. Remember imperialism, okay? So now step number 8 is the Battle of Britain. And once France is secured, we're just bombing the crap out of southern England. But Hitler gets bored. He beat everybody else so quick, and Britain's taking longer than everything else. And so it's almost like he got bored. Also, he has to pull resources, number 9, right? He has to pull resources down into Yugoslavia and into Greece. And of course, he has to get German troops actually in North Africa because Italy's not pulling its weight. This is almost all of Europe. Now, step number 10, of course, is this secret deployment. And you can see these 3 branches. 1/3 of the German army goes for Leningrad, a.k.a. St. Petersburg, a.k.a. Petrograd. 1/3 of the German Operation Barbarossa is going to the heart of the Soviet Union, Moscow. And 1/3 is going into Ukraine. And their job is to get all of the resources of Ukraine, including oil-rich areas in the Caucasus. They kind of get sidetracked at a place called Stalingrad, and that is going to become the biggest battle in the history of the world. More people are going to die in Stalingrad than any other battle in the history of planet Earth. Okay? Here's a little picture of the rescue, the miracle of Dunkirk. Maybe I should rewind it real quick. See where Dunkirk is, just barely over the border into France, right next to Great Britain, about as close as you can get, close to a place called Calais, right, or Dover if you're on the English side. But it's a miracle. They're rescued at Dunkirk, okay, and it's spelled different ways if you're French or if you're English. Anyways, Dunkirk. This is what France looks like. Territories annexed by the Reich. You got the occupied zone where there's actual Nazi troops. And then you have the free zone, or the Vichy government. It's the de facto seat of government. But there is, and of course, the Italians are, occupying part, doing their part. There is a complete resistance, though, kind of led by Charles de Gaulle, occupied France. We call it the French resistance. They might look like a regular schoolgirl, but after school, she's going to carry around a machine gun and shoot Germans in the streets. They'd have drive-by shootings. It's amazing what they did to try to thwart the German control. Whatever happens, the flame of the French resistance must not be extinguished, and will not be extinguished. Tomorrow, as today, I will speak on Radio London, right? That's from Charles de Gaulle, using the British, airwaves, right? The radio, to get that signal out, right? And they're hearkening back to the French Revolution, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity. This is some scenes from the Blitz, okay? Where they're bombing London at night. People are sleeping in the metro, okay? So I just think it's a really amazing. There's lots of movies out there, right? About this whole Blitz. I don't know if you saw like the Chronicles of Narnia. I know it's a fake story, but at the beginning it shows the Nazis bombing, and that's why the kids are taken out to the countryside. That happened, right? They parents would have their kids move to relatives or even just to strangers to get them out of London, because London was being bombed every single night. Okay. And this, of course, is the Operation Barbarossa. 1/3 of the army going up here to Leningrad. They surround Leningrad and siege it. It's amazing what happens in Leningrad. It's horrific. People turn to cannibalism because they're starving to death. The Germans surround the town and just beat the crap out of it, but never take it. If they had sent the entire army to Moscow, they might have won the war. Instead, they split it up into 3 pieces. Even some of Hitler's generals said we're making a mistake. There was a lot of German generals who said, if we could just get Hitler out of the way, we could win the war. This guy's holding us back. We could win. And of course, the devastating end of Hitler is not in Stalingrad, but it's really where his army is crushed. He doesn't quite get to Moscow. They come within shooting range, but just don't quite finish the job. They get to Stalingrad when they should have been going for the oil and the breadbasket of Europe and Ukraine, but instead they get sidetracked to Stalingrad and end up pulling resources from other places, and then winter hits, right? The Luftwaffe is the German Air Force, as we talked about, and the RAF is the Royal Air Force, and they stand alone against the Hun. And again, they use the word Hun, referencing back to the Roman times. The French and the British called the Germans Huns. If you don't know your history, it was the Huns that brought about the end of the Roman Empire. And that's back, before medieval times. So the Huns were seen as the destroyer of civilization itself. And that's what they're calling the Germans. They're hearkening back to history, the Hun. If you look at this map, it looks like Hitler did a pretty dang good job. Those red parts of Europe are the parts that the Nazis took over. Hitler didn't have to worry about Sweden because she was a neutral country and kind of sided with Hitler. So he didn't have to fight Sweden. They didn't give him any trouble per se. Spain, and maybe you heard this before. Maybe you heard this before in my lecture. But the leader of Spain is a fascist as well. His name's Francisco Franco. So Hitler doesn't have to worry about Spain. Hitler actually helped Franco come to power. So even though some of these are looking like they're allied countries, Hitler doesn't have to mess with them. Nobody's really resisting him except the British. And now that he stabbed Stalin in the back, the Russians. Okay? All right. Allies take Hitler's fortress Europe. So how do the Allies win if Hitler's kicking so much butt? The real problem is the Soviet Union, the Red Army. The Russian winter stops the Nazis. It's not even so much the Russian army, although I'm not trying to discredit the Russian army. It's just like what happened to Napoleon a little over 100 years before. Remember unstoppable Napoleon? He was stopped by the Russian winter. It's almost the exact same story. The Germans go into Russia. They go in unprepared for the Russian winter. Their tanks freeze over. Their soldiers start dying of cold. And the Russians are used to it. Stalin pulls in some of his Siberian troops that grow up in Siberia, like the coldest place on the planet Earth, where humans shouldn't live, but they do. And it really is the Russians, the Soviets, that break the back of the Nazi war machine. It's really the Russians that they spend their blood and their treasure to stop the Nazis. I know as an American, we always like to put ourselves in the hero position. We like to think of ourselves as defeating the Nazis, but it is the Soviets. They stopped the Nazis. So they started to push the Germans back from the east. They lift the siege of Leningrad. They battle for Moscow and come out triumphant. And the Battle of Stalingrad is the most epic battle in the history of the world. And shortly thereafter, the Battle of Kursk is the biggest tank battle in the history of the world, all on what the Germans will call the Ostfront, right? The Eastern Front of the war. And the Eastern Front is a different war. On the western part, when the Germans are fighting the French and the British, people die, and it's war, okay? But there's kind of a gentleman's agreement. Even though the Germans don't like the French and they don't like the British, they kind of see them on their same level. There's a sort of respect, like, hey, we beat you, but they don't think they're subhuman. They think they're better, but not subhuman. When they go into the East, into like Russia, they kill mercilessly. And when the Russians come back, they're going to kill just as mercilessly. There are these ghosts of the Ostfront that still haunt Eastern Europe. It's absolutely mind-boggling. So how do the Allies win? The Russians stop the Nazis. There's a second stage, and this is happening at about the same time that the Russians are starting to push back. The Allies instigate what they call Operation Torch. Now, if you look at the dates here, in 1942, remember the United States joins the war effort at the very end, and I mean the very end of 1941. Remember December 7th, 1941, the date which will live in infamy, Pearl Harbor? That's December 7th. So you know it's really 1942 when the United States gets involved. Operation Torch. Almost all of Europe was controlled by the Axis powers. Boom. Okay. So how do you get into Europe? You don't. What you do is you get into North Africa. North Africa is huge. It's not as heavily guarded. And so the first move to take Europe was to invade German and Italian-controlled North Africa in 1942. Operation Torch is, well, if I could rewind again 1 minute here, um, the British are already in Egypt. Remember imperialism? The British are already in Egypt, and they didn't lose Egypt. So they're going to push, places like El Alamein are going to become famous. The British are going to push against the Germans and the Italians. And then the Americans are going to land ships in Morocco and Algiers and places like Tripoli. And we're going to try to squeeze, the Germans out. And eventually we're going to squeeze the Germans out with Operation Torch, and they're going to retreat back up into mainland Europe. And then once we control North Africa, then we can start working on Sicily and then Italy, and we can start to have planes fly and take crack shots at the Germans. And if we don't ever lose control of Great Britain, right? They held out, they almost caved, but they didn't. Now we can start bombing the Germans from the north, and if we can, hit them from both sides, and of course the Russians are going to be pushing in from this side, that's ultimately how we're going to win. Okay, so after North Africa is taken, then the Allies are going to move into Italy. Again, the Italian army was not as effective as the German army. And the Italians, this is kind of a sad title, but they called them the soft underbelly of Europe, meaning that if you're going to fight the Nazis, it's going to be a painful fight. But fighting the Italians, not so bad. And so American troops moved into Sicily, that's the island, and then into the main part of the Italian peninsula by 1943. And so we were able to secure Italy before we were able to take the rest of Fortress Europe, if you will. Okay. Probably the most famous part of the war in Europe is D-Day. This is where the Allies invade the coast of Normandy to liberate France. It's referred to as Operation Overlord. On June 6th, 1944. There were 5 beaches. Maybe I'll pause and I'll show you a map and talk about the different beaches and maybe explain a little bit about Normandy. Normandy is like the worst place to invade because there's high cliffs the Germans controlled, and you don't want the enemy to have the high ground because then they can see everything, and it's like shooting ducks in a barrel. It's so simple for the enemy. But we chose to go there because it's the place the Germans least expected us to attack, because it was the worst place to attack. Okay, and this, of course, leads to the Battle of the Bulge. That's when the United States and the UK and liberated French troops pushed into Germany from the west, and this is the last German offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Let me just explain them with some pictures and maps, and we'll try to make sure you understand these 5 pieces of the Allies winning. World War II in Western Europe was sort of a gentleman's war, but on the Ostfront, the Eastern Front, both sides played dirty, and it was a war of survival. So what happened in Russia, the death casualties are astronomical, and the brutality is just, it's hard to comprehend what happens. And when the Germans go into the Soviet Union, they hit real cold. I teach in Southern California here in Apple Valley, and during the winter, some people are like, oh, it's so cold, because it almost gets to freezing. And, like one time it snowed, even though it melts like 2 hours later when the sun comes up. But in Russia in the winter, we're talking not 40, where we think it's cold, 40 below 0 Fahrenheit. That's like 80 degrees colder, right? It's kind of incomprehensible to somebody from Apple Valley, California, where we live, to understand how cold it really gets in Russia, where if you turn off your tank, it stops. You can't get it to go again because it freezes. Gas lines start to freeze. It's so stinking cold. I have some videos embedded in my notes, and you're always welcome to check those out. I think it's good to get some visualization, both from movies and actual clips. But again, Stalingrad is one of the most deadly battle in the history of the world. And there's stories. You could talk for an hour just about Stalingrad alone. Why the Russians won, how it was really like a battle of ego, where Hitler was willing to do anything to win, and Stalin, the city's named after him, so he doesn't want to lose Stalingrad. And what do they care? They're not there, so they're sending men off to die. But eventually, the Soviets do win the Battle of Stalingrad. But millions of people die at this one singular battle. The Battle of Kursk is the biggest tank battle in the history of the world. It takes place on the East Front of the war. This is a little look at the Allies invading North Africa. Before we could even get into Europe, we had to secure, bases in North Africa to be able to combat the Nazis. We couldn't even get into Europe to fight the Nazis. We had to first come into North Africa. And you can see we landed troops in Morocco around Casablanca, and we landed them near Algiers. And of course, the British are going to be pushing in, towards Tripoli. There's a huge battle at El Alamein, and eventually, of course, we're going to kick the Nazis out, which gives us access to Sicily. Again, the real problem is getting supplies, and the real war, as Churchill said, the real war is the unsexy part. It's the part where you can't fight if you don't have food, and you can't kill the enemy if you don't have bullets. And so it comes down to production. It comes down to factories. It comes down to supply lines. It's not all about heroics. And so the Germans, they used a whole bunch of resources to patrol the Atlantic with their U-boats in wolf packs. That's what they called them, these Nazi wolf packs. They would hunt down Allied ships. I saw a great movie a couple months ago, Greyhound, Tom Hanks. He's captaining a ship across the Atlantic, and they're being hunted by these German U-boats during World War II. Once France was controlled by the Nazis, they created what they called the Atlantic Wall. They put tank traps, barbed wire on the beaches of northern France. And then, of course, they would build these pillboxes, concrete bunkers. I took my family to Normandy when we were in France, and we got to go inside some of these bunkers. And it's amazing. You're on this cliff looking down at the ocean, and you're like, holy cow, how could anybody attack this? It's like an impenetrable fort. And that's probably why it was such a bad idea to go to Normandy, but also such a good idea. It turned out to be successful. It's a gamble, like everything in life. And the reason it's so risky is because look at the high ground up here. Imagine it, you're not just crossing the beach unprotected with machine guns shooting down at you, but you have to get up, the cliffs to secure locations the whole time while you're being bombarded. So how scary, and there's clips, of course, like from Saving Private Ryan, lots of other movies where they try to recreate this D-Day invasion on June 6th of 1944. I remember playing a video game, one of the first shooter person games, and it was really cool. On this video game, you were like watching real video footage, documentary footage of the D-Day invasion, and then it slowly transformed into like the more video game style, cartoony kind of thing, and then you got to control a soldier on the beach trying to get across the beaches through the tank traps and stuff like that. D-Day, June 6th, 1944, the beaches at Normandy. So as you can see, let's recap those 5 steps. Remember, step number 1, these blue arrows are showing the Russians or Soviets pushing back against the Germans, right? Remember Stalingrad and Kursk, and of course from Leningrad. So we're pushing back on Berlin. That's the Soviet Red Army. Of course, you have this Operation Torch going on. Okay. And the Operation Torch is the North African campaign, landing Allied troops into North Africa so that we had a chance to fight the Nazis and setting up bases, right? And there's all kinds of famous battles that take place in North Africa. Then, of course, the next step is to move into Italy. Sicily is the island here, and then the main boot of Italy. Okay. And then this last step right here would be this D-Day invasion, the invasion in Normandy. Hitler thought we were going to come right here, pretty close to Dunkirk, Calais. It's the most logical place to land giant numbers of troops. And so Hitler had pulled all of his troops up to protect Calais, and we hit Normandy down here, and then swung in and took Paris. The last offensive, of course, is the Battle of the Bulge, where the Germans try to punch back towards the sea, creating a bulge in the line. But that's routed, and we meet together. You can kind of see where the Allies and the Russians, the French and British and Americans cave in. It is the Russians that take Berlin. So when we think about defeating Hitler, it's actually the Russians. American troops don't get into Berlin not until after the war, during peace accords and stuff. So anyways, all kinds of what I think are some great clips. This one is like what it's like for Germans on D-Day. This gives you a little closer look. We had created this plan to throw off Hitler. And we actually built a fake army near Dover, and they actually put General Patton in charge of a fake army with fake weapons. So it looked like we were massing our army to come over to Calais, and Hitler bought it. We leaked the right information to the right people, and so Hitler moves all of his troops up by Calais, and we hit these beaches here. Two of the beaches were American beaches. We codenamed them Utah and Omaha Beach. Those are just code names where the U.S. troops landed. There were two British beaches, Gold and Sword. Those were the ones the British were supposed to secure. And the Canadian troops did Beach Juno. Those are all code words for this stretch of rugged, tough land that generally is called Normandy. Okay. It's a great place to visit. We spent, a week or so up in this part of France when I went there with my family, right next to Cannes, and Rouen down here, right next to the Seine River, to be honest. We were in a little hotel right on the Seine and came over here and spent some time on the beaches of Normandy, just checking it out. And you can kind of see where the U.S. Landed on Omaha and Utah Beach. And of course, paratroopers, that is parachuters, were dropped in behind enemy lines to cause communication disruptions. So the 101st Airborne is parachuted behind enemy lines. Ships hit the beach, and pretty soon we secure a beachhead, is the military lingo for securing a place where you can get supplies and men in. And then we started to push towards Paris, pushing out. Anyways, there's a lot of great movies out there, and sometimes in class I'll show a few minutes. It's quite graphic, so I'll warn you, if you check out some of these clips, they're pretty intense, but some great clips. In 1933, when Hitler was coming to power and the Nazi political party was starting to show its true colors, there was a Jewish physicist named Albert Einstein, who moves to the U.S. when Hitler comes to power. And some of his ideas are going to be put into action. He knew Hitler was already working on atomic energy. And Einstein goes to the U.S. president and says, you have no idea how close they are. If we don't get on this, they're going to be unstoppable. And so the U.S. actually led some secret operations to destroy some labs where they were developing nuclear technology. And we put our own best scientists, which honestly were a lot of Germans who came over to the United States and defected, all right? Because Germany really did have some of the best scientists in the world. And after the war, here's just a little side note, after the war, the United States collects some of the best German scientists because we were years, maybe even decades behind the Germans in rocket technology. So some of the greatest rocket scientists in the United States during the Cold War were Germans who were working for the Nazis. But we gave them a get-out-of-jail-free card because they were super smart, and we figured we could use them to help our own military. One of the ugliest parts of World War II, what really makes the Germans ugly and bad and evil during World War II, is the Holocaust. I would like to start off by reminding everyone listening that not everyone in Germany was a Nazi, that not everybody in Germany agreed with these policies. But nonetheless, it's something that we have to deal with. And the Holocaust is the worst genocide recorded in history. A genocide is when a specific group of people are targeted and systematically somebody tries to eliminate them systematically. The Holocaust is not the only genocide. There was a genocide in the 1990s in Rwanda. There was genocide in the 1990s in Europe in the Balkans. There was genocide against the Armenians in World War One. A genocide is where a specific group of people they're trying to systematically kill them. The title for this genocide is the Holocaust, where over 6 million Jews are killed in this anti-Semitic genocide. Those not of the Aryan master race were considered undesirable, and they were put into death camps, right? Who were the undesirables? Communist. It wasn't just Jews. Communists were targeted. Gypsies were targeted. Anybody of Slavic origin, homosexuals, anybody that the Aryans, these Germans deemed undesirable, handicap, people with Down syndrome, they were targeted and systematically eliminated from society so they didn't pollute the master race. It's not until Allied troops move into Germany that the true horrors of the Holocaust were known. So when the Nazis are doing these things, people hear rumors about these death camps, about these concentration camps. And everybody knows that the Nazi regime is anti-Semitic. That's never in question. But we didn't know how far they had gone until the war was over. So this stuff was going on the entire time, and some of it even before the war started. But we didn't really know how bad it was until the end of the war, and Allied troops start finding these death camps and these crematoriums with bodies being burned and these giant mass graves. The Red Army, that is the Soviets, they liberate a lot of the really famous ones in Poland, like Auschwitz. The Americans come across a fair number of them, and General Patton, when he sees them, he does some really good things. He makes sure it's documented so that there's evidence, so that if anybody ever tries to deny the Holocaust, people like General Patton made it possible. He forced German citizens in the areas to go to the concentration camps and to witness for themselves. And some of these German citizens said, "We didn't know this was going on." And he said, "Shame on you. You should have known. This is your country." That kind of an idea. So Patton helped document the Holocaust. The German secret police, remember the Gestapo? They were the ones who were rounding up Jews in occupied areas and put them in ghettos, like parts of town that were undesirable and fenced in. And then later they were moved to concentration camps that were run by the SS. Remember the Schutzstaffel? That's the secret, that's the secret or specialized branch of the military. The Gestapo and the SSS are very similar. The Gestapo are more maybe in plain clothes kind of secret police, whereas the SS are in military uniforms, and they're like the special forces of the German war machine. That they're the hardcore Nazis. They're the real National Socialists who are willing to do the dirty work. Auschwitz is maybe the most famous death camp. It's in Poland. When I was in Germany the first time, I went on a tour of Dachau. It was one of the bigger ones. These are some of the more famous ones in the final solution of the Jewish question. As some people call it, the final solution. Instead of working them to death in these slave camps, if you will, they just started to exterminate them. And again, some of the Nazi generals said, "Man, if Hitler wasn't so stuck on killing the Jews, we would have won the war. He was spending so much effort to destroy and kill the Jews that he took resources that we could have used to win the war." And it's pretty true. I mean, a lot of resources, troops that are trains that could have transported troops were instead used to take Jews to death camps. So it's almost this megalomania that ends up undoing Hitler, where the Germans could have won the war maybe. So most of the camps were liberated by the Soviet Red Army as they move and take Berlin. Hitler dies, and Germany surrenders on May 8th, 1945. People will tell you that Hitler committed suicide. I believe that's true, but it's hard to document since there was nobody else really around per se. There's lots of rumors. Some say that he took cyanide. Some say that he blew his own brains out. Some people say that the Soviet army had Hitler's body after the war and destroyed it so that there wouldn't be like here's where Hitler died kind of a thing. The battle for Berlin is ugly, house to house fighting, and in the end, Hitler's dead. There is some like conspiracy theories that Hitler escaped before the war was over because nobody had his body, right? There's no been like, hey, here's Hitler's body. We know where Mussolini's body was. When Italy was taken, people took his body and hung it in the public square and beat it with canes and bats and clubs. I mean, it was drugged behind, in cars and stuff. I mean, it was mutilated. And Hitler was like, there's no way that they're going to do that to me at the end of the war. There were some Nazis that did escape at the very end of the war. There was a fascist dictator who ran Argentina at the time, General Perón, and a lot of Germans went to Argentina. It kind of became like a safe place for Nazis to go to at the end of World War II. I mean, it's kind of random, Argentina, but if you know anything about Argentina, it's a lot of Italian immigrants. It's a very white country, um, where some places in South America are dark skinned people because they Spanish mixed with the natives, but Argentina is very European. Um, this is, of course, a famous photo of these emaciated bodies, these Jews who were found at the end, walking skeletons, and so malnourished it was hard to conceive that people could live at that state. There's some disturbing pictures. If you go to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, there's an amazing Holocaust museum, and it's amazing to walk through, and it's hard to be there, but I think it's also an important thing to be there to witness and to realize that this happened, that if we're not careful, any of us could find ourselves in a position of doing things that we normally couldn't conceive of. And these mass graves and the treatment during the Holocaust is staggering. Allied troops came across trainfuls of dead bodies. This transportation, some were alive, some dead, some full of just dead bodies. Um, you probably, when you were younger, you probably learned about Anne Frank, right? That little Jewish girl who, in Amsterdam, you can go visit her little cubby hole, where she hid out and people helped keep her safe, or at least tried to. And what happens to her. And, the Diary of Anne Frank is one of the most famous works of literature that comes out of World War II. But it's just staggering. The Nazis did human experimentations. It just gets ugly. I remember that one of the most prophetic things that I ever did when I was in Europe is I went to a Nazi camp in Belgium. It's not a very famous one, um, but to me it was really awesome because it was raining and it was miserable that day, and there's barbed wire fences are still up, and when you walk in it still kind of smells musty, and you can still see the bullet holes where they executed people, and you can go in the basement and see torture devices that the Nazis used in their human experimentations. And it was just like, whoa. I've been there a couple of times. I went there when I was in college, and then later I took my family to this a small place in Belgium, Brindonk. Really interesting place. And you can get little headsets where you can listen to the stories in English or whatever language you need. This is, of course, a picture of General Patton forcing regular Germans to witness the atrocities of the Holocaust, documenting what happened. And I got some little video clips, what it might have been like to. These are actors, in a series, portraying what it would be like for American GIs to help liberate a concentration camp. After the war, of course, there's a lot of finger pointing. Who's really responsible? Is the guy who pulls the trigger and kills Jews in an execution, or the guy who pulls the lever in the gas chamber? Is that the guy responsible? He was just following orders, right? Who really is the architect of this whole final solution? And so Nazi leaders are put on trial for war crimes, crimes against humanity. They call it the trials at Nuremberg. And it's one way where we tried to come to terms at what had happened in World War II, and trying to ultimately figure out who's really responsible for this. Hitler's dead, right? Hitler's body is gone. We don't have Hitler. Hitler can't stand trial. He's dead. So who's the next person in charge? Goebbels, the propaganda guy, he incited this. What about Goering or Himmler? Right? Where does it stop? Who's really the guy who's responsible? And people are executed. Some people choose suicide. There's a couple of these top Nazi guys who have people sneak them cyanide and kill themselves before standing trial. But it gets ugly. Who was really responsible for the Holocaust? And everybody's pointing fingers, and we're trying to see. That guy who smashed in people's heads. He was following orders. The guy who pulled the trigger. We always say Hitler did this and Hitler did that. But Hitler's one person. There was a lot of people involved. And where does the blame lie? And that's what it was all about. It's not just about the people who died. It's about the people whose lives were affected. Refugees who lost their homes, who lost their livelihood. The UK, US, and France pushing into Germany at the end of the war, and the Soviet Union pushing in from the east. I want you to remember this picture right here, because when we talk about the Cold War, we're going to come back to this very idea of how World War II ends. It's going to set up World War III. Now, thank goodness, World War III doesn't heat up to full conflict, so that's why we call it the Cold War, because it didn't heat up to full-on battle. But I want you to come back and think about this at the end of World War II, as the three key allies pushing in from the West, and the Russians and the Soviet Union pushing in from the East, is going to set up the stage for World War III that, thank goodness, didn't happen. Man, there's so many things we could talk about in World War II. This video might be way longer than I anticipated, and yet I'm just scratching the surface. There's so much. I've been teaching for about 20 years, and I'm always learning new things about World War II. It's like an endless well of awesomeness and craziness and sickening, horrific things. But one thing that, of course, is very famous from World War II is the Enigma machine. It's the German code machine. It's freaking ingenious, and every day the code changes, and it's impossible to break. In fact, some people will talk about the first computer in the world was invented to try to crack the Enigma machine because it's so complex. It's absolutely amazing. This is the Battle of the Bulge. It's called the Battle of the Bulge because it's the last time the Germans are on the offensive, and they almost pushed to the sea. The Allies had landed in Normandy and were pushing towards Germany. And then the Germans pushed back, and their job was to get to the ocean and push the Allies back, put their backs against the ocean and destroy their invading force. It almost happens. Some of the U.S. Army gets surrounded, and it's an ugly winter in between 1944 and 1945. That's the Battle of the Bulge. This is U.S. and Soviet troops meeting in Germany because we were on the same side. I mean, there's a whole campaign. We could talk about strategic bombing versus just blanket bombing. In World War II, we were torching German cities, purposely dropping incendiary bombs, just trying to force German surrender. And places like Dresden were devastated. I mean, just burnt to a crisp. And there's no way to understand how many people really died. And some people say, well, the Germans deserved this. They started the war. They were bombing London first. But that's human life. And remember, not everybody in Germany is guilty. Maybe they're guilty by association. I mean, that's why I love the social sciences. There's so many complex things to talk about, right? The 101st Airborne Division is famous because they're the paratroopers that are dropped in, right? These paratroopers are dropped in from planes. This is a brand new technique of dropping troops. You know, you can get them to a battlefield fast, and they're very quick and mobile, right? And we start round the clock bombings on cities. The Siegfried Line is the line of defense crossing over from France into Germany. Of course, the Germans had put these concrete blockades, and this is like supposed to be Germany's last defense as the Allies are pushing in on her. I mean, I grew up in an era where my grandpa fought in World War II. And so we had little toy trucks and little comic books and picture books with all these cool World War II, all kinds of tracked vehicles and meta vehicles and artillery pieces and the Panzer tanks. And I mean, it was kind of just like we grew up in. Like you guys grew up in a superhero world. Well, we grew up in this time looking at all these things were actually used in World War II. That was kind of like our toys, like the B-17 Flying Fortress. Okay. Um, Here's something interesting I put at the bottom. My brother served in the U.S. Air Force, and he was stationed in Germany for a while. And he worked for the Air Force as an engineer, and he would talk about if they were going to like lay runway or even build a building. He was at a small little base, Spangolum. It's really close to Luxembourg by Spitzer, Bitburg, and Trier, that area of Germany. And he would say that they still have to have bomb squads come in and do some work before they dig ground in Germany because there's still unexploded ordnance left over from World War II. No joke. They'll still find bombs in fields when they go to build stuff, unexploded ordnance that can still go off. I've heard that on the news. Anyways, that's just an article from 2019, but they're still finding it now today. This is the B-17 Flying Fortress. This is before jets. This is still propeller planes, but you get guns every direction. The rudder guns, the top gun, side guns, top turrets, the nose gun, and then, of course, a bunch of bombs to drop. And you've seen these in World War II movies. Dwight D. Eisenhower, we talked about before, top U.S. general in Europe. This is celebrating in Paris at the end of the war, the VE Day, the Victory in Europe Day. Thousands of people are displaced. That's a key word we should probably pay attention to. Refugees, right? Refugees. To end, I'd kind of just like to talk about why Hitler lost the war. Number one, Hitler should have finished off the British, but he grew impatient. Remember that Blitz? He was winning. The British had their backs against the rope, but he failed to throw that final punch. Number two, the Italian failure is Germany's problem. How's that for simple? Italian failures are Germany's troubles. It causes German resources to be spread out. He picked a bad friend. And of course, number three, he invaded the Soviet Union. And it's huge. And he did it too close to winter. And he split his army up. And they get stopped by the Russian winter. The Russians, of course, used a scorched earth policy as they retreated. That scorched earth policy is a policy of we defend our town to the last man, but if the Germans are going to take it, we'd rather burn it down so they don't get our resources. It's like you defend a bridge, but if the Germans are going to take it, blow up the bridge. So it's weird. You would sacrifice your life to defend the bridge, but in the end, you might end up blowing it up yourself just so the Germans can't use it to cross. That's a scorched earth policy. It kind of is giving ground for a little extra time. And then if you hold off the Germans long enough, then the winter hits. And of course, I think we talked enough about the Battle of Stalingrad and Russian history really refers to this as the Great Patriotic War, because it's hard for Americans to comprehend how many Russian lives were lost. You know, the blood and treasure of Russia was spent on winning World War II. If Hitler had been a better student of history, he would have seen the follies of going into Russia unprepared like Napoleon. Guys, there's a ton of great movies and TV shows and TV specials and documentary series. This is just a small collection of them. Maybe you've seen some of them. Maybe you should see some of them. There's just a whole list from TV shows to movies, and there's probably even some that I haven't put on here just because they've just come out since I recorded this. Like I just watched one the other day called Jojo Rabbit. That's a great flick about the Holocaust. I really recommend that one. That's the latest one I've seen. Of course, there's some great videos, crash course and review videos on World War II. Again, next week, I'm going to focus on World War II in Asia. That's right. We've only covered the European piece. So we still have some more to learn about World War II. There is some great podcasts out there. I highly recommend Hardcore History, Ghosts of the Ostfront, or next week I'll promote one called Supernova of the East, where you can learn even more about World War II. It's an endless thing. If you like it, if you're interested, keep learning. Thanks for being here. We'll talk to you guys next week.